Hi all, I would like to welcome you to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. This webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the question and answers function. My name is Carla Gomez. I work for Agrihealth Ireland as program manager for the Pig Health Check program. I'm also the president of the Irish Pig Health Society, and I'll be joined by the secretary of the Irish Pig Health Society, Shane McAuliffe, in moderating this webinar. Just to give you some background, the Irish Pig Health Society was founded in 1969. Its aims are the advancement and dissemination of knowledge concerning all aspects of pig health and production. The Society usually organizes a symposium once a year. Last year it was cancelled due to COVID, and this year our symposium is going to be a series of 3 webinars, all on Wednesdays and starting today. I'd like to take this chance to thank our sponsors for their continued support. So today we'll speak about global, local, internal and external biosecurity perspectives. And for that, we're joined by 3 speakers from Ireland and abroad. So I'll start by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Egan Brockhoff. Egan is a graduate of the Western College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. Egan is a president and a practicing veterinarian with Prairie Swine Health Services in Alberta and Manitoba. And in 2010, he began providing consulting services in Asia, focusing on veterinary training, infection prevention and control, and enhancing biosecurity capacity. Since 2008, Egan has taught swine medicine at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, and since 2014, he is the veterinary counsellor for the Canadian Pork Council. Egan, the floor is yours, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was looking forward to being there live, but this is exciting. I've got my screen open, and I hope everyone can see that. Does that show up okay?
That's fine, Egan. You can see that.
Great. Okay, good. So a number of topics to cover today. A few more introductions. This is my veterinary team at Prairie Swine Health Services. They're the ones that really keep me motivated and going every day as we work with our client base, and even as I do work with the Canadian Pork Council. But I have a great team, and certainly that makes everything that much easier. So African swine fever virus, I think we've all heard so much about this virus in the last few years. It's taken up so much of my daily life. I can't remember sort of pre-African swine fever, but there's a lot of discussion out there right now about, is this virus changing? We're all dealing right now with the genotype 2 virus, and that originally came in through Georgia in 2007, and that virus has moved east and then south into Southeast Asia. But there's a lot of discussions now in both China and Eastern Europe that this virus is changing. And I think that change has given me as much concern as anything recently. They're talking about a longer course of infection. We're talking about more asymptomatic pigs, and some pigs completely recovering, potentially being carriers of the virus. That, in association with this paper that was published out of the China Harbin laboratory, really gave me cause for concern this year. So they discussed the emergence and prevalence of naturally occurring lower virulent African swine fever virus strains in domestic pigs. And they described 22 new field isolates from 7 provinces collected over a very short period of only 6 months. And this gave me pause, and I think it gave a lot of people pause around the world. What is happening in China? What's happening in the rest of the world with this virus right now? If you look at this virus closely, I mean, it suggests there are variants emerging in China and emerging quickly. This is concerning. And at the same time, though, we're getting reports of gene-deleted vaccine viruses being used illegally in the field, resulting in chronic infection and increased virus transmissibility. When I think back to my second or third last trip to China, that was about early 2019, mid 2019, and there was already reports then of 6 to 8 vaccines being tested in the field, with no safety and efficacy trials, not registered vaccines, just vaccines being used. That's a very similar story to what happened with PRRS virus when high pathogenic PRRS circulated in China in the previous decade. And there's no question that resulted in faster spread of the virus and more variants being moved throughout the country. So a lot of concerns, I think, arising from the news we're hearing. These low virulence strains, if they were come to Canada or Ireland or any of our other negative countries in the world, this could really hamper our early detection efforts. If we've got low virulence strains, it could take weeks longer, perhaps even more than a month longer before we notice or find the virus. And by then we could have significant spread. These lower pathogenic strains, perhaps we could be dealing with chronic infections and carriers emerging from that. Again, something that complicates our ability to early detect and prove freedom of disease. And then low virulence strains, we use this term all the time in Canada called masking diseases. What are the differentials that look similar to ASF that require further if ASF is changing, are we going to have more opportunity for people to miss the virus because they think it's a severe strep suis outbreak or something else similar to that? So all of these together, I think, complicate our ability to perform surveillance, complicate our early detection, and certainly complicate our proof of freedom. Feed has been discussed a lot, and the picture on the left is a picture I took of piled corn. The picture on the right is a common sort of image we see often in the news. We talk a lot about African swine fever virus or other foreign animal diseases moving in feed in North America. In early 2014, when we first broke with PED virus in Canada, there was a feed connection. And so when African swine fever moved into China, and we started recognizing just how many feed ingredients we import from China, this became a big deal for us. So we had performed a industry government risk analysis on feed, and that work continues. And actually on the right, you can see an unpublished paper that we just submitted between government and industry here in Canada, and that'll be going in the Journal of Transboundary and Emerging Diseases, and again on the whole feed issue. Canadian Pork Council and myself representing them on that front, we approached the federal government and really got great support from them. And so in 2019, the spring of 2019, our minister declared secondary control zones, and those result in import restrictions for unprocessed grains and oil seeds. And so we were really excited to get this put in place. And so essentially any high risk feed ingredient, organic soybean meal, for example, imported into Canada has to go through a secondary control zone at one of our 6 importing ports. And that means it being held in quarantine for time and temperature if necessary, to ensure that there's no live virus present in feed. So we really are trying to keep on top of this and minimize that as a risk for ASF entry into Canada. And I think it's something that all countries need to focus on to stop movement of virus. So I began working in China probably 10 or more years ago now, and certainly ASF has had a dramatic impact. Lots of reports out. Of course, with COVID-19, I haven't been able to get back to China for a little while now, but lots of Q1 reports coming out of China with my colleagues and work associates over there on what is happening with ASF. And by all accounts, it looks like these lower pathogenic, but potentially more infectious strains are causing a significant challenge in China. There may be vaccine-associated strain challenges here. It's difficult to know. But what is clear is everyone is reporting similar, that the number of pigs have declined dramatically in this quarter. And that may be primarily from ASF, but they're also suggesting that PED and PRRS virus are all working together through the efforts to restock the Chinese pig herd. So we could be looking at a reduction as significant as the entire North American herd, to be honest. Our last visit over there, we actually were working a lot with bringing gilts into farms. And so there's just extremely high demand for gilts. This is a picture I captured at a gilt sale location. And this was a very common way gilts were being sold. It's a little bit like an auction, but not quite like a traditional auction. So still a lot of meat type gilts are being selected for breeding, and that's had a significant impact on production, probably a 20 to 30% reduction in production. We still see backyard pork production in China, and of course it is decreasing, but we do see significant backyard pork production in China still. Typically, these are small lots, and the pigs are held outdoors in various different forms. You still see a lot of this when you are driving around China. Pigs strapped to the back of bikes. They may be in little kennels, little dog kennel type structures. They may be alive. They may be dead, like this pig. And when you start thinking about how African swine fever virus is moved, well, oftentimes it's moved at 60 kilometers an hour down the highway on the back of a motorcycle. And so this is a human-driven disease, and the virus continues to move in many of these unique ways. Some pictures that I took just a few years ago, but you can see that these barns are getting a little older, and we saw a lot of specialization and acceleration of pork production through the 70s and 80s. And you still see a lot of these larger legacy pig barns, very simple structures all across the country. And as the demand for pork just continued to grow, we saw more and more of this technology adaptation, movement towards larger centers where there'd be 1,000 sows, and then 5,000 sows, and then 10,000 sows. Life on the farm is interesting, and I know I have stayed and slept on many of these farms over the years. Like so many of my North American colleagues, I have no hip mobility. And so squat toilets have always created a real challenge for me. The picture on the right, though, this is a farrowing room. And inside every farrowing room, it's very common to see a bed for farrowing room staff to stay in and sleep in. Oftentimes, they'll spend, not oftentimes, most of the time, they spend the entire evening there in the farrowing house. And so barn life is certainly a little different there. We started seeing a lot of change, though, in pork production over the last 5 years. And I think all of you have seen all of the news stories on these large multi-story pig barns across China. And they are certainly growing and accelerating everywhere. We see these all over the place now. This was a presentation by Pat Von Tersch lately that I listened in on another large production unit being built built in China. And this has become the norm. There is an opportunity to put as many pigs as possible on this land, and they are going for it. So this was a farm that I had a chance to spend half a dozen trips over in China working on. My job over there was to help develop biosecurity protocols for building this farm on top of a mountain. And it was certainly a remarkable experience working at these multi-site barns. And this barn development sat on 80 hectares with the goal of producing 1 million pigs a year. And they literally just started flattening the mountain out so they could start building pig barns, residences, feed mills, truck washes, all of that infrastructure onto the top of the mountain. And the top of the mountain gave them a lot of advantages. Number one, this particular farm is in South China. It's very warm, it's very humid. Up at this level, things are cooler. Makes pork production a whole lot simpler in some respects. Gave them access to land where there was no other construction, where there was no regional hog density. And so trimming a mountain made a lot of sense. Putting these barns up certainly wasn't simple. I think in the beginning, a lot of new technology had to be developed just to sort of understand how we make a multi-floor pig barn more functional. And so whether these barns are 7 floors or 13 floors or 12 floors, there's a lot of concrete that goes into these to keeping them the size that they are. So these particular barns were designed for 1,000 sows per floor. Some of the barns were parity segregated, where the parity ones were on lower floors, and some of the barns had mixed parity segregation throughout. It was just a little bit of an experiment to see what could work and what didn't work in these examples. Dead stock, the scaffolding on the right, surrounded with the green screen, is surrounding a large dead stock drop tube. And so all animals, regardless of the floor, go down this dead stock drop tube into movable rendering carts at the bottom. Those rendering carts, though, they become quite a mix for disease. And at the time, especially PRRS virus, we could find multiple strains of different PRRS viruses in those dead stock areas. And so that creates a huge biosecurity challenge. The building on the left is the multi-story pig barn. The building on the right is the residence where people sleep. And I didn't include any of these pictures today, but a lot of the residences that I've stayed in over the years have been right over and above the pig barns. And actually, really, they're very simple structures, but they work really well. There is games room, there's kitchen, there's lots of socializing space. There'll be karaoke machines. There's a lot going on to give everyone sort of a sense of community there. The barns themselves, on the left, you see all those windows, and those windows open up into an air filter chamber. They don't open up directly into the barn. So I'll get some pictures of that here shortly. Anyways, living in the staff residence, very interesting, very, very interesting experience. Because of ASF, a lot of the barn workers just aren't able to go home anymore. So it becomes a full-time, year-long residence for many of the people at these sites. So this is just inside those windows that you see outside, and you can see this air chamber. And this is where outside air comes in, and then it's filtered before it goes onto every floor. There's also individual water for every floor, and there's also individual manure management. The goal of this originally was to really deal with viruses like PRRS virus, Mycoplasma, APP, so on and so forth. This is a challenge. This is a real challenge from a biosecurity point of view, because although you can create filtered floors, there's always permeability. There's always holes that you didn't account for. And, you know, for example, all of these barns, to load the floors, we load them with elevators. And so the elevator shaft creates a challenge for air introduction. The elevator itself, as it moves from floor to floor, has to be cleaned or lined with something to be changed. You have to be careful that people aren't moving between floors. So a lot of challenges from a biosecurity perspective with both air and manure and people and feed and so on. So when finished, when finished, these facilities have become really interesting sites. The pigs are introduced into elevators and taken to the floors. The people are introduced into elevators and taken to separate floors. Now, remember earlier I said 1,000 pigs per floor. It's really difficult, though, to find a single gilt source to fill one floor, or to even empty some of the older pig barns that may be in your system. You're often introducing animals of various health statuses, mixing diseases, and even if you were ASF negative, you still have a lot of challenges in front of you. These gilt startups, APP, just good old-fashioned APP bacteria, create a lot of challenges in these barns. Transport sanitation is always interesting. Typically, when I arrive at these barns, they want me to spend 3 nights in an isolation room. And so that means 3 nights in isolation, somewhere near the barn, no exiting, no entering. They want us to adhere to this downtime. But while you're in that isolation barn, there may be 16 trucks an hour moving pigs in and out from multiple sources. And so biosecurity can be really complicated. People entry, although there are elevators, and a lot of those elevators have cards, digital card readers, so they only go, if you work on the 5th floor, your card will only take you to the 5th floor. But there's always stairways that go around this. Smoking is a very common behavior. And so lots of people go up to the roof to smoke. Lots of people go down into the stairwells to smoke. It certainly creates biosecurity challenges. Food. One of the big things that emerged in the beginning of the ASF outbreak was food. There was a lot of worry that ASF virus was being spread onto fields with contaminated manure, and the crops, the fruits and vegetables from those fields could pose a risk. Everyone put this really high on their biosecurity matrices. And so this is a common example of what we see. Food gets delivered not to the barn. Traditionally, food would have been delivered to the barn, or there would have been a kitchen at the barn. This farm, though, has modified that. Food gets delivered to an outside site. You can see in the second picture, it gets put in these baskets. And then in the third picture on the right, all of the food is dipped in citric acid or another disinfectant. And certainly feedback from the farm that they could taste a difference. They were always a little unsure of what products were being used for disinfectant. And there's no question this created some anxiety on all sides. So are fruits and vegetables a risk? Ongoing discussion. Some of the real challenges we face with these multi-story barns, though, is pig density. When viruses start rolling, even if there's filtered floors, viruses can really get rolling. PED virus outbreaks can be huge in these facilities. And even though there's significant biosecurity, the area spread of the virus just gets so robust. PRRS virus is the same. Across these sites with multiple barns, there's no question that we can have 50 to 100 different strains of PRRS virus circulating throughout these locations. And so that creates a challenge in itself. Filling these barns is a real battle. It's really hard to go all in, all out by floor. It's almost impossible to go all in, all out by barn. And the same with all in, all out by site. So although there may be high biosecurity, exclusion biosecurity, you're still seeing loads and loads and loads of gilts from different sources, perhaps bred sows being moved from multiple different locations that have been shut down or depopulated to accommodate these large sites. And so you do run the risk of significant disease introduction and significant disease circulation with these larger sites. It certainly has created a real biosecurity challenge for me as I've worked through that. So my experiences with ASF in China certainly led us to do a lot of things here in Canada to try to reduce the risk of ASF introduction into Canada. We've spent a lot of time working on private-public partnerships, so that's industry, government, to develop new trade tools to protect the pork sector, because Canada exports 70% of its pork production. And so any incursion of a foreign animal disease will lead to significant market disruption. Canada has zoning agreements just like the European Union. And in fact, one of our core trading agreements with zoning is with the European Union. We also have one with the United States and are working on other zoning agreements. But as industry looked closely at zoning agreements and still what the market disruption would be, you know, we weren't happy with what we saw. Zones are established after detection, and that's fantastic. Zoning is primarily a movement restriction and a disease control tool. They're not marketing tools per se, they're disease control tools. In the event of a foreign animal disease, we're going to have border closure, we're going to have market disruption. That could lead to a reduction in the inventory value of the farm. It could make accessing money and resources for the farm extremely difficult. And so we could find ourselves in a crisis situation, you know, within hours of our first announcement of a foreign animal disease. And the more we looked at it, the more we realized we wanted other options. And so we started looking at compartmentalization. On the left is a classic zoning graph. There is a country highlighted in green, and there's an infected zone at the top and a free zone at the bottom, and there's a biosecurity barrier separating the two. And that barrier is based on a geographical basis, and it may be a river, it may be an artificial control zone, or it may be legal boundaries between provinces or states. On the right is compartmentalization, and this is defined by management and husbandry practices, and it's primarily based on biosecurity, disease surveillance, and animal traceability. And so you see those 4 blue boxes surrounded by the black highlight, and those are biosecurity barriers around farms that all work together to form a compartment, and there's infected premises all around them. And so if you look at a country the size of Canada, you know, zoning could knock out half of our country when there's only one infected premise within a 3-kilometer circle. And so compartmentalization was something that was happening in other species groups around the world, and we wanted to introduce this to pigs. At the same time we started working on this, the OIE started working on a new guideline for compartmentalization. So we started working on compartmentalization here in Canada, taking it as a market access tool with the goal of having no trade interruption. Industry would work with government to help develop the program, and it could be established with our trading partners in peacetime. And contrast that to zoning. We still want zoning agreements, but they're much different. They are primarily disease and movement control tools. There will be significant, devastating trade disruption. Government has complete control of that. There isn't that industry government partnership, and it's always established after disease detection. So our goals with this project, the objectives of compartmentalization is really to mitigate the overall impact of an African swine fever outbreak. We are building an African swine fever compartment just for that disease, to provide individual producers with a means to reduce their risk with an ASF outbreak, and to support zoning efforts by reinforcing the country's biosecurity, traceability, and surveillance infrastructure. A lot of advantages to compartmentalization. We think it will work very well with zoning, but a compartment can be established, approved by the Government of Canada or the competent authority of any country, and accepted by trading partners before a disease outbreak. The compartment can be made up of a single farm. It could be a genetics company that wants to export genetics around the world. It could be multiple integrated farms, and we have many of those in Canada, farms with 100,000 sows under the same ownership and management. And so they could form a compartment. And what I really love about it is a joint effort between industry and government. And so producers get to have a voice and they get to be involved. So a lot happening here in Canada with ASF prevention, with planning and preparedness, but we still feel like we have a lot to do. We've had our National Emergency Operations Center activated now since 2018. So 3 years of intense ASF preparedness work. We really want to find a way to continue to maintain that momentum. It's teaching us a lot about the challenges we face in our sector, and it's also teaching us a lot about the opportunities we have to strengthen our sector. We've got a lot of work to do both on zoning and compartmentalization. We're running drills on a quarterly basis in our different regions, putting zoning into place, working with our traceability system, and we continue to develop our compartmentalization project. A lot of advocacy on response programming. There's no clear government support plans or industry support plans in the face of a disease like ASF. We know what's going to happen with the infected premises. We know our regulatory bodies are going to come in and dispose of those pigs quickly and stamp the disease out aggressively. We're more worried about the 99% of other producers in the country that now have to deal with a closed border, with their inventory value going to zero, with the inability to move or market pigs. So we're focusing a lot of effort in advocacy and planning and preparedness for that group. We have an active destruction and disposal working group that's been in place for a number of years, and we still haven't found great solutions to mass disposal of large populations. We've got a number of different technologies being tested, but this is difficult and requires a lot of support and a lot of effort for something we may never use, but we really need these tools. A lot of time spent on strategy implementation for ASF preparedness. And then Canada has some wild pigs. They are not native. The Eurasian wild boar is not native to North America. They were introduced in the United States hundreds of years ago from ships from Europe. In Canada, we introduced Eurasian wild boar as farmed animals in the 80s and 90s, and some of them have escaped, and they have created populations now that we may still have an opportunity to eradicate. So this is going to be a big one for us in the coming decades. So anyways, big thank you to Carla and Shane for inviting me to speak this year. Would have been lovely to be over there in person, but sincere thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some of our experiences with ASF work.
Thank you, Egan. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm sure it will raise a lot of questions. We'll take all the questions at the end after all the presentations are done, and we'll continue in the theme of biosecurity, but this time giving the example of poultry. So our second speaker is Dr. Ciaran Cunningham. Ciaran graduated from UCD in 2001 and has done general practice from 2001 to 2005. In 2005, he has done a master's degree in food safety management and worked 1 year in SAC as a disease investigation officer. In 2007, he started working with Agrihealth as a poultry vet, and currently he is the technical director at Agrihealth. His interests are in poultry, disease management, biosecurity, hygiene, and zoonosis control. So now it's over to Ciaran. Thank you.
With Agrihealth based in Monaghan. And I'd like to thank Carla Gomez for the invitation to speak to you today in relation to poultry farm internal biosecurity. So just to talk first of all about the biocheck UGent and the availability of biosecurity audits for pig and poultry farms by our veterinarian. There's been an interesting some slides here Carla has kindly shared that show that the poultry farm's internal biosecurity is somewhat better than the pig farm internal biosecurity. So poultry seems to be better in relation to cleansing and disinfection, and also the movement or traffic movements between houses and compartments would be better in relation to poultry farms. And obviously the entrance of personnel and visitors into the sheds, etc., would deem to be much better. Pigs deem to be better on typically purchase of animals, so they're quite closed herds, which is not as obviously relevant for poultry. Also, just another slide just outlining the number of pig units that have been assessed in relation to the biocheck and the number of broiler sites that have been assessed. Unfortunately, probably well, the broiler side and on the poultry side in the layers as well, which is available, the biocheck. It's been a difficult year or 15 months because we've had COVID issues, obviously you can all appreciate. And also we had an outbreak of low-path avian influenza last year, which kind of has curtailed the rollout of the biocheck on many farms. But hopefully in the next 4 to 6 weeks, we'll see that getting traction again. So poultry farm internal biosecurity, I suppose from our assessments, infectious disease can be spread by various sources. And obviously there's a list here of what those sources could be. We could have water sources, disease stock. There's various avenues of how we can introduce disease, but often cases what we find is that diseases can be walked into the building. That's something we would regularly see. Waste management is also a very important area. I'll touch on that later on. Water hygiene is something that we've a great interest in. But also with poultry, we have risk of airborne disease in some cases and vertical transmission in some diseases, which can come from the parent stock. So internal biosecurity on poultry farms, we talk about monitoring flock health on an ongoing basis. So that could be a vaccination status of rearing birds, for be it breeders or layers. Also, we would routinely screen for salmonella commercial birds, so broilers, turkeys, layers on an ongoing basis for salmonella. We also screen broilers for Campylobacter. Having the all-in, all-out in poultry farms is advantageous from the point of view of disease control. But traffic management, use of PPE, correct application of PPE and sanitation, we see these points as being very critical for disease risk mitigation on poultry farms. We see those 3 points as being very important from the point of view of disease risk on poultry farms. So obviously we're all aware of the prerequisites for good biosecurity. We need a good perimeter fence, but we often find that infrastructural issues on farms, walls, panels, roofs, etc., these can be a big risk of disease carryover and obviously introduce disease into some flocks. So from our perspective, we try and limit our visits as veterinarians on the poultry side to, if we can, one a day. But obviously, if we are visiting more than one farm a day, we would go from the youngest to the oldest birds, or a high health status to a lower health status. There would be no limitations on our movements in this regard, obviously with the exception of notifiable diseases such as low pathogenic influenza. So we don't have the challenge that some of our pig vets see in relation to the 48-hour clean status. And I suppose something I would say today is I would actually challenge that concept somewhat. Is it required to the extent that it is deemed to be an accepted practice? Typically, when I arrive on farm now, what I would see is I would use 3 pairs of overshoes from my vehicle into the board area. So we'll talk about that later in relation to the relevance of those overshoes and what we're trying to achieve by doing that. Other actions are needed on farm to mitigate disease carryover and introduction. Pest control farm waste, very, very important. We see with Campylobacter increases in fly populations associated with late spring, early summer and into the autumn. So our cases of Campylobacter typically can rise on farms in those times. That's correlated very much so with a huge rise in fly populations. We also see cases of vibrio hepatitis in summer, early autumn, which is also associated with movements of cattle slurry and flies also. Rodent control and pest control also critical from the point of view of controlling salmonella and diseases such as pastorella in poultry flocks. Recently, we had a farm with a 25% mortality rate with a pastorella outbreak associated with poor rodent control. So basically, this was an oversight on the behalf of the farmer where he wasn't paying strict enough attention to rodent control. Carcass disposal and storage is also another area which is very important from the point of view of disease carryover from batch to batch on farm. So obviously, dead bins are washed, disinfected pre new birds arriving on farm. A lot of our farms now would also be using freezers or cold rooms to keep the carcasses under a certain, say, 12 degrees to mitigate any fly populations. Some examples of good practice at poultry farm level. So here we have obviously a foot dip at a door and a foot dip on the right of the door as well. But it's an interesting piece on the door on the right is a little metal box here. We'll show you later what this is. But foot dips, from my perspective, are kind of irrelevant on poultry farms nowadays. They are a requirement, obviously, from the point of view of quality assurance schemes and from DAFM, but what we find is they're not managed correctly, and also what we do find is that they are a reservoir potentially of bacteria from and can actually contaminate boots in some respects. We also are trying to achieve a store area or anteroom in our sheds that's as dry and as clean as possible, because that in itself reduces the potential risk of disease introduction. Here we are again with another poultry shed. This is a breeder site, where a breeder rearing site, where we have a step over barrier here, where the farmer has his boots here, obviously on the left hand side, where he sits down, takes off those boots, swings across, puts on shed boots or plastic overshoes to as part of his hygiene lock. We would see this as a very accepted system in commercial laying rearing or in broiler breeder rearing, but we would also find it probably not acceptable from the point of view of broiler flocks for the control of Campylobacter, which we'll discuss later. Hand hygiene, proper hand hygiene, hot water, hand sanitizer available, also very, very important. Dead bins and where they're located on farm, also very important, and the fact that they're emptied at the end of a batch of birds and washed, disinfected. Also, we see a lot of farmers now moving over to cold rooms for handling these bins. So just to talk about some case studies in relation to internal biosecurity on poultry farms and how we can, what measures we've gone to try and improve internal biosecurity to try and control certain diseases. So Campylobacter, this little spiral bacterium here, is the biggest cause of food poisoning in Ireland and the EU. Poultry is deemed to be the biggest reservoir of this bacteria. And what we found over the years is a huge level, a very high standard of biosecurity is required to reduce the prevalence on poultry farms. So this bacteria colonizes the birds very, very rapidly in a poultry shed. Typically within 48 hours, all the birds will be pretty much positive with Campylobacter after introduction. So it's not a case of we're trying to reduce the levels of Campylobacter. We basically don't want Campylobacter introduced into the shed in the first place. In fairness, with various measures we've and recommendations and training with farmers, we have had huge success in relation to the prevalence of this bacteria. So to me, Campylobacter free status, this is a true biosecurity test of the farm. We are testing every broiler flock pre-slaughter. This involves cecal sampling at the slaughterhouse, and as I said, negative results are expected. We do use numeration for our testing because we want to differentiate between a very, very recent infection and a more long-standing infection. So we are doing, we are counting the bacteria as opposed to giving a positive, negative result. We can trend data from batch to batch and farm to farm, and what you do find is there is undoubtedly a trend on farms with poorer standards of internal biosecurity, poorer sanitation practices, where we see higher prevalence and higher incidence over a 12-month period. So negative status, as I say, is possible. However, there's plenty of challenges indeed, terminal hygiene being one of them. So to talk about zoning the access, so the hygiene lock on broiler farms now, we actually are looking at 3 zones now where we're trying to mitigate the risk of Campylobacter into a poultry flock. This involves basically an external footwear change. We call it the green area. So we try and leave our external footwear outside. We then move into take off our shoes, put on another pair of maybe Crocs or slip-on shoes, easily to take off again, to move into the amber area, which is our anteroom area. This then is our next barrier. This anteroom must be dry, free of organic matter. If we walk into a shed and it's wet floors, organic matter, it's proof that the farmer is not practicing his hygiene lock correctly. Obviously, then we have a final footwear change into the red area, as we call it here, which is the board area, which is the final part of the hygiene lock. So this is what this looks like at farm level. This little metal cover here is an area where we're actually putting our outside shoes here. You see on the picture on the right. So we're totally breaking the risk of contaminating the anteroom floor with these outdoor footwear. Then obviously we have a second, the red area then is our entrance into the board area. So our shoes are left obviously in the anteroom here at the bottom, and then we step into new boots, which are dedicated boots for the board area. Also, the bucket you see here on the picture on the left-hand side, we also have designated buckets for the mortality. So when farmers gathering mortality, we have designated color-coded buckets whereby this bucket will not leave that board area. So the farmer will tip the boards from that bucket into a different bucket in the anteroom, which will then go to the dead bin for disposal. A very high standard of biosecurity. It's a very robust hygiene lock. So what are the advantages of being Campylobacter negative? Obviously, for the farmer and for the consumer, we're producing a safer food. It's evidence of better on-farm practices and we have seen reduced disease pressures on farms because of this. Campylobacter also has an effect on technical performance in poultry flocks. So as a consequence of negative status, we've achieved improved technical performance. And some companies have bonus schemes in place for Campylobacter-free poultry. Terminal hygiene monitoring has been a huge part of this success story as well. We are using rapid testing methods, which is more quantitative as opposed to qualitative testing. We are also assessing the hygiene levels on primary and secondary areas, so the areas the birds are in contact with or the general surfaces outside of that. Residual disease risks are important on farm as well. So we see water hygiene being critical for new flock arrival or for day-old arrival. We have seen issues with E. coli, Campylobacter, Enterococcus, Streptococcus, etc., where we've had contaminated water sources, stagnant water in water lines, heavily contaminated. So the terminal hygiene aspect is critical on poultry side. It's not so practical, I can appreciate, on pig units. So just quickly to look at another case study here, Salmonella. We had an outbreak of Salmonella enteritidis in 2015. There was 650,000 birds culled on farm. What we noticed was a huge risk of reinfection on some farms. Where we see the issues there was internal drains. So some farms had decided that to remove water at washing a terminal clean, they installed internal drains in their house. These internal drains were a huge risk for reintroduction of Salmonella. We also looked at vehicles. As part of our testing methods at the time, we were looking at every single area at that farm, be it internal or external. So just to show how the farmer had breached the biosecurity in many sites, the vehicles, the footwell of cars, bobcats, skid steers, steering wheels, computer screens, we cultured Salmonella enteritidis from all these surfaces, showing that footwear farmers were not respecting the hygiene barrier and the hygiene lock. We also have many cases of exotic types of Salmonella, which can be, whilst non-notifiable, there also can be a risk of, can be food safety risks associated with them as well. Many times in these situations, what we've discovered is the persistence on farm is associated with infrastructural issues. So walls that are broken, concrete broken in the bottoms of walls, waste management issues where people have been sharing waste tanks with possibly cattle on farm, and overall poor terminal hygiene practices have had an impact on the carryover from flock to flock. So I suppose to try and sum up on what I've spoken about today, the take-home message is that farmers need to take their internal biosecurity very seriously. I think it's important to try and achieve a push for high standards as much as possible. Challenge people who are not focused or compliant with your internal biosecurity practices. And it is my opinion, and we have plenty of information on this, that a consistent high level of biosecurity will result in a healthier flock, less medication, reduced disease levels, and increased profit for the farmer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ciaran. Just a reminder, please put your question in the Q&A function so we can go through it later on. So our last speaker is Dr. Iain Mortimer. Iain graduated in 1989 from Melbourne University. He worked in mixed practice in Australia and then moved to the UK, where he worked also in mixed practice. He then worked for Elanco in the UK and Australia, and then returned to UK, where he worked as a pig vet in the industry and in his own consultancy firm. Since 2015, he joined Agrihealth. His interests are in disease eradication, preventive health, and data analysis. So we'll have Iain speaking, but as I mentioned, please do put your questions in the Q&A function. And as soon as Iain finishes his talk, we'll go through those questions with the three speakers. Thank you.
Ciaran, and thank you to the Irish Pig Health Society for the invitation to speak. Now, Ciaran talked about biosecurity in poultry. I don't intend to go over the same ground again for pigs. It's already been covered. So what I would like to do is cherry pick a couple of areas that I think can be improved in the pig industry, and if they were improved, would have tangible benefits. Now, if you look at external biosecurity, by far the biggest risk of external biosecurity is bringing pigs onto the farm. I mean, pigs carry pig diseases, and that's why the poultry industry actually fared worse than the pig industry on the biocheck, because the system in the poultry industry is to bring day-old chicks onto the grow-out farms, then depopulate the farm, and then bring the next load of day-old chicks on. They're not really going to be carrying that much. They're taken straight from a hatchery. So I think it's a little bit misleading. If you were then to go on to the next biggest area for breaking external biosecurity, which would be visitors coming onto the farm and walking through the farm, poultry fares much, much better. If you would look at the system in pigs, or the protocol for visitors coming on the farm in pigs, first of all, every pig farm would expect you to wear farm overalls and boots. So leaving that aside, the next four things, in the order of frequency, would be an expectation your pig clean, that you shower in, that there is a hygiene lock, and that hygiene lock is enforced. The one at the top is the most common, the one at the bottom is the least common, and that is completely the wrong way around. Not only is the hygiene lock more important, and enforcing that hygiene lock more important than the shower and the 48 hours pig clean, but if you do not have a proper hygiene lock, the shower and the 48 hours pig clean is completely pointless. Now, Ciaran went through the principles of a hygiene lock in the poultry industry, and I said I wasn't just going to repeat what Ciaran said, but honestly, the hygiene lock is so important, I believe it's very worth going through it again. Now, there's a site, Pig33, it's 3 3s. It's a Spanish site. It's also written in English. It's a fair number of farmers are aware of it, and if you're not aware of it, you are likely to know somebody who's aware of it. They've got a lovely video on the hygiene lock, or external biosecurity, I think it's just simply called, there, where they are demonstrating how it should be done. It's a little cartoon. It runs about 3 or 4 minutes. I've shamelessly uplifted it and taken a few screenshots and put them here on this slide. The scenario is a visitor who's going to be walking around the farm, is coming onto the farm. As you can see there from the first slide, there are areas in red. The suggestion is that the red refers to contamination. The visitor is likely to have been on other farms, maybe not even that day. However, there is an assumption then that his car would be contaminated. The inside of the car would be contaminated, and also the wheels and the outside of the car would be contaminated. As it's trying to indicate, things like the steering wheel, the dashboard, and the footwell will be most contaminated, and therefore the visitor, it will be his feet or her feet and hands that are the most contaminated. The external part of the car, it'll be the wheels that are the most contaminated. When the car drives onto the car park, it contaminates the car park. When the visitor gets out of the car, his feet contaminate the car park and the surrounds of the farm. When the visitor enters the farm, he'll contaminate the door with his contaminated hands. The idea of the hygiene lock is that as soon as you then enter the farm, you are in what is considered to be the dirty area. There is then a physical separation between the dirty area and what is then the second area, the grey area, which is usually a bench. You sit on the bench, you take off your shoes, and without putting your socks, or if you take off your socks as well, without putting your bare feet on the ground, you swing over to the grey area where you can then put your feet on the ground. Once you're in the grey area, you access your clothes, you take off, you don't access your clothes, you take off your contaminated clothes, you put them back into the dirty area, and then wash your hands. You would then walk over to the clean area, which is the third area, and without entering, reach across, grab your clothes and dress, then step in, as they do in the poultry industry, into your on-farm boots in the clean area. You would then be considered to be clean. I saw practice with a couple of vets I got friendly with in Denmark. I wasn't going there to see Danish show farms. I just got friendly with a couple of Danish pig vets when I was doing a lot of disease eradications, and they offered to take me around, see practice with them. I probably spent 2 to 3 days with two of them, and so would have seen, they see about 4 or 5 farms a day. I probably would have seen maybe 20 to 25 farms in total. Every single one of them had a system like that. Not one of them had a shower, not one of them was expecting you to be 48 hours pig clean. Okay, I see from the time there I've used up half my allocation on 2 slides and there's 6 to go, so I'll have to skip a few things and hopefully speed up as well. Internal biosecurity, I'm going to skip the terminal hygiene, which is the cleaning and disinfection of the sheds between batches of pigs. It's been done ad nauseum, and I don't think I'm going to be able to helpfully contribute to that sort of argument or process. What I will like to go into, though, is the other aspect of internal biosecurity, which is the tracking of disease from one group of pigs to the other. That is, older pigs to younger pigs, or sick pigs to healthy pigs. In poultry, that's usually covered by a hygiene lock on every shed. As the farmer or the visitor moves from shed to shed, they go through a hygiene lock. That's really not that practical on a pig farm, on most pig farms anyway. So there needs to be some sort of protocol in place to try and stop that movement. Foot dips are used extensively. In reality, dipping a dirty boot will not do any good at all, and in fact will then contaminate the dip and potentially deactivate the dip, so it couldn't work even on clean boots. Work boots can't really be cleaned, and welly boots, the only effective way of cleaning them is with a power hose. Just a little quote there from Douglas Adams to remind me, we could put a protocol in place and think it's absolutely perfect, but there'll always be somebody who will find a way of breaking that protocol. What we need is a way of not so much monitoring the protocol itself, but monitoring the effect of the protocol. If the protocol is there to stop something, then monitor whether or not we were able to stop it. In the poultry, they use Campylobacter. They know that internal biosecurity can stop Campylobacter, and then they monitor the birds at the end of the crop for Campylobacter, and if they're positive, they know the internal biosecurity is broken down and they can go back and work out why. So they're continuously assessing it. In pigs, I think PRRS can be used to monitor internal biosecurity. The virus is ideal to be used for monitoring. It is generally not picked up by the piglets from their mothers, so they come out of the farrowing house negative. If they come out positive, there's something fundamentally wrong with the PRRS control on the farm, and that needs to be looked at. So the pigs coming out of the farrowing house negative, they're protected by the maternal antibodies for a period of time, but are then susceptible. When they break down, they are therefore breaking down by being infected by older pigs or sick pigs. So it's a breakdown in internal biosecurity that's causing the infection. Diagnostics for the virus are extremely good. Not only do we have a means of determining antibodies, that is whether or not the pig has been exposed to the virus, but we can also check to see whether the virus is in the blood, which will be able to pinpoint where the virus is coming in, usually down to 1 or 2 days. So we can find out where the virus is circulating, put a biosecurity protocol in place to stop that circulation, and then check to see whether or not the biosecurity has stopped that circulation. Okay, a case study, Alex in Tipperary. The herd size is substantial, so it's representative. If Alex can do it, then other farmers could at least try. Background on the farm, a sero profile was done, the EPRA sponsored sero profiles, and looking at the PRRS, that circulation of PRRS did not occur until the pigs entered the finisher accommodation. That's quite unusual in Ireland. The majority of farms, the PRRS virus circulates in the second stage. If you look at Alex's farm, it's a combined first and second stage, so there's no independent second stage. And talking to EPRA and then looking at other farms with a combined first and second stage in Ireland, that's quite common. When there is a combined first and second stage, that is no movement from first stage to second stage, the virus doesn't circulate until the finisher. So it would look very much that breaking down with PRRS isn't just simply the pigs come off the maternal antibodies, they become susceptible and break down with PRRS, that the movement of pigs from one accommodation to the other sets the infection process off. In other words, the movement is the break in biosecurity. So we could then look at whether or not improving biosecurity during the movement would help stop the virus from becoming infected as it got into the second stage. Now, what Alex did was, you couldn't, of course, a hygiene lock would be perfect for that on the sheds, but there wasn't sufficient space for that. So instead, the equivalent of a hygiene lock was put in to the office and tea room area with a boot cleaning power hose and foot dip on entering into that and exiting that hygiene lock. Not ideal, and certainly not to the standard that I showed earlier along, but it was the best realistically that could be done under the circumstances. As you can see here from that middle photograph, a makeshift dirty clean barrier was put in place. There wasn't space to have a grey area. I wonder, with a little bit of thought, we might be able to put in a grey area of some description, but boots were removed and put on across that barrier to try and stop infection from tracking in and therefore moving from stockman to stockman whilst they're having their break. It also meant when they went on break, the boots were cleaned and disinfected. They were then also asked to go through this hygiene lock whenever they were moving from older pigs to younger pigs, or sick pigs to healthy pigs, and they would not only change their boots but change their overalls and wash their hands as well. Okay, so after doing all of that, we went back 12, it was probably more like 18 months later, and repeated the herd profile. This time, the entire grower herd was negative. So we thought we'd actually succeeded, but just to check, we went back 3 to 4 months later after the results were available, and this time simply concentrated on the very oldest pigs, the pigs just before slaughter. Because if any of the finishers are going to be positive, it's going to be them. And we took 10 bloods from 3 weeks pre-slaughter, 10 bloods from 2 weeks pre-slaughter, and then 10 bloods from pigs that were at the point of sale, that were going to be sold the next day. 10 out of 10 were negative 3 weeks pre-slaughter. 10 out of 10 were negative 2 weeks pre-slaughter. 9 out of 10 bloods were negative at the point of sale. 1 out of 10 bloods was positive. So we went back 3 months later and just checked that. And likewise, 10 negative, 10 negative, 1 positive. So we reviewed the biosecurity, tried it again, exactly the same story. We've reviewed it again. We think we've come across a few things that we probably fell down on, and we haven't quite taken that second load of bloods yet. We're looking to do that over the next few weeks. But when you look at that profile and the fact that it's only 1 out of 10, and consistently only 1 out of 10 pigs positive at the point of sale, it would suggest that infection is coming in the week before sale. And if you correlate that then to the poultry industry with Campylobacter, then the poultry vets will tell you that they can keep Campylobacter out till the point of thinning, and that thinning and the traffic and the potential breakdown in biosecurity that thinning causes, that the farms break down with Campylobacter. And I would say exactly the same thing is happening here. I think the chances of us actually succeeding are quite high, and I'd be confident in the next load of bloods, simply probably because PRRS is transmitted less easily than Campylobacter. But that then is just simply a way of getting a benefit from internal biosecurity and checking that your internal biosecurity is good. If you're able to do that, then you're clearly doing the right thing as far as internal biosecurity goes. Now, of course, not every farm is PRRS positive, but at least if it becomes known that certain things are good at keeping PRRS out, then if they are applied on other farms, we at least know we're putting a protocol in place that has an effect. Time is up. So just very, very briefly, I've talked there about just one aspect of external biosecurity and one aspect of internal biosecurity, simply because I think we can do things about those two aspects. But I would just like to emphasize that never look at biosecurity in isolation. Sometimes exposure to bacteria is actually, or viruses, is actually a good thing. If they are exposed in low enough volumes and at the right time, it can immunize the pigs. When if they are exposed at higher volumes and at different times in life, it can be considerably more damaging, and biosecurity really isn't good enough to be able to stop the pigs from ever being exposed. I would look at strep and APP very much in that vein. I don't think biosecurity will ever, on a standard farm anyway, will ever be able to stop APP or strep from spreading. Also things like E. coli, post-weaning scour, where the pigs are carrying E. coli. The aim of biosecurity is to drop the challenge dose rather than to remove it from the farm or stop the pigs from ever being exposed to the strains that cause post-weaning scour. Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much. We've been past the time, as I've seen. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, our speakers, and all of you that are still there attending. I look forward to seeing you all next week in our second webinar that will focus on the principles, details, and daily practices for improving pig health and welfare. So please register for it if you haven't done it already. And I just finished thanking again everyone and saying have a good morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you are. And look forward to see you again. Thank you.